Initially I worked with PHP, and then started hearing good things about Rails and became interested in it. And then I experimented with Rails on a couple like personal apps, and then I built my first Rails app in about 2012. And I've built a couple Rails apps from scratch, as well as worked with existing Rails apps since then. So then in March, I started a brand new Rails project, so I had a chance to kind of use some of the patterns that I'd been reading about for a while. And this project was going to be an HR and training system for dental practices. So there was also potentially going to be future functionality like payroll, time tracking, secure document sharing. It was also going to have roles and permissions, and there'd also need to be like uploading documents, categorizing documents, as well as managing employee data like name, emergency contact, social security number. So like I said, because this was a new project, I got to try out some new stuff that I've been hearing about for quite a while. I don't know. I feel like there was a popular article by Code Climate back in 2012, and it was called 7 Patterns to Refactor Fat Active Record Models. And those patterns were value objects, service objects, form objects, query objects, view objects, policy objects, and decorators. So I continued to read about those patterns for a while, hearing like about people implementing them and what was working, what wasn't working. So this was finally a point where I was going to be able to implement some of them and see how they worked out. And I also gained some experience with these patterns on some existing projects, but I'd never had the chance to like implement something from scratch. So I also found it a little challenging to pinpoint like an agreed upon definition for each of these patterns. Like I hear decorators and presenters and view objects and query objects and form objects. So yeah, so I feel like the patterns that I chose, the names that I chose, I don't necessarily know if these are just nobody seems to have agreed upon, like, do we call them presenters, do we call them view objects, do we call them decorators? I'm sure there are like probably someone somewhere has defined what they are, but there's a lot of debate over that, it seems. So here's I'm going to give 2 examples. One is of the index action in a controller, and the other is the update action, because I felt like those kind of covered all the basis. The index action is pretty different from like the new edit, new create, edit, update. So where's my little pointer thingy? There it is. Okay. So there? Okay. So request comes in, hits the controller action, and the first thing that happens is a policy object gets created, and I decided to use Pundit, which is a gem that just gives you some basic kind of like convenience functions, just kind of, it doesn't couple you too tightly to any kind of structure, which is nice. So you pass the current user in, and in this case, because it's the index action, there's no like active record instance. So you just, well, I'll show you in the next slide here. And then because it's an index action, we need a collection of something, obviously, because we're displaying a collection of records. So I use the query object pattern, and then passed the result of that to a collection presenter. So I use the presenter pattern. Again, not sure if that's quite the appropriate name. And then that gets passed to the view. So the collection presenter essentially like creates a layer between your model and your view. So you're being explicit about what you're going to allow to be presented from your domain layer. So here's an example. It's kind of tough to see. I don't know how to fix that.
Lights off? I'll do it.
Oh, okay. They did get brighter, I realized. Yeah, there we go. That's better. Thanks. So here you go. So this is like everything I just described. That's everything that's happening here. So authorized is something Pundit gives us, and you pass in this case, because we're not like editing a record specifically. So we just pass. You can either just pass the class name, or you can do .new, and then we load up. Here's our query object. that I'm passing a current account, which is similar to a current user. And then that's returning a collection of library documents, and then passing that collection to the library documents presenter along with the current user and the policy, because, well, I'll show you in a little bit why that's necessary. You need to give, like, the presenter and the form objects need to know the context sometimes of the current request. So, okay, so let's just go back here. So we have the control over the policy, query object, collection presenter, and then all of that gets passed down to the view. And so here's an example of a policy, and this is, again, from Pundit. So they tell you to define, so there's like this is what's nice about it, is because it's so flexible. So you define this application policy, which kind of goes along with the Rails convention. In Rails, they have like application record, application controller, and so it's just taking a user and a record. And then I had to simplify this down. There's a good bit more to it, but I'm just showing the important parts. One thing that we had trouble with, like with roles and permissions, so I think we kind of got to a point where we outgrew Pundit a little bit, because essentially you have to define, so for every controller action, you have to define who has access. So there ends up being like a lot of conditionals. And that can get hard to test, because then you're trying to mock things to try to get to like an else if branch that's 3 statements down. So I don't know if I would recommend Pundit for anything other than maybe like a 2-role system. We had 4 roles, so you can see here super admin, account owner, account manager, and then we had an employee role. One thing that did help was defining default permissions. So this got applied globally, meaning these were the set of permissions that were most common throughout the application, and we defined like index, update, new, edit, create. So all of those got defined on application policy and set the default permissions. And then if you needed to override them on the actual implementation of the policy for that specific model, you would override it. So in this case, the index action, the default permissions aren't appropriate in this instance. So instead, we're saying only the super admin can view a list of library documents. And then here's what handling authorization. So back in the controller here, this line, authorized library document new. So it news up an instance of this, pretty much, actually, this. And if this fails, it raises this error, and then you can rescue from this error in the application controller, and then just do whatever you want to do. And in this case, we were just providing a generic flash message and then redirecting back. If we didn't have the back, we'd fall back to the dashboard. This is nice too, this after action verify authorized, because I realized, well, what if I forget to call authorize in a controller? This kind of covers you. So if you don't call this, Pundit will not let you hit that route. They'll raise an error saying you haven't called authorized. So that kind of prevents you from forgetting to authorize controller actions, which is nice. So let me just go back again to, so that's the policy. So now moving on to the query. Typically in previous Rails applications, I would just have a model with like tons and tons of scopes, and the tests for the model would get bloated because you're testing not only like the business logic, but you're testing all of the scopes. And so I felt like this was nice to move out into its own little just plain. Oh, actually, this isn't plain objects. We're using so I used a package called, or a gem called Rectify, which is just an accumulation of other gems that introduce convenience functions for implementing those various patterns, like form objects, query objects, presenters. So again, following the Rails convention, and kind of shielding the implementation from the fact that we're using this package. So in case I decided I want to use Rectify, I could either implement my own version of it or use another package potentially, and then I don't have to go through and update all my query objects, which ended up being quite a few of them. And that was another nice aspect of having separate query objects, is you could just like ls, the app queries directory, and you can kind of get an idea of like what the app's about, like what types of queries the app is using. And naming, like initially I had some trouble like trying to come up with a good naming scheme. I think I settled on like list if you're returning a collection of something, list like the thing, and then any kind of conditional for that query. And then if you're just returning a single thing, obviously drop off the list and just kind of use the name that maybe the business owner would use if you were having, you know, a conversation, or the stakeholder. And it's pretty straightforward, super basic. I'm actually like reaching back into Active Record to do the actual queries, so it's kind of just like a full circle. And they're easy to test, so that's another nice. I felt like there was a lot of benefits. I didn't have a problem though throwing like a simple little scope, like to retrieve active records or something, instead of creating a whole separate query object. Okay, onto the presenter. Was kind of hard to like try to fit all of this. So we start out with a base presenter that's just including some common behavior, some convenience functions from Rails, like the route helpers, URL helpers, and like HTML tag helpers, and then my own set of common behavior for the presenters. And there's two types of presenters. One is a collection presenter, and the other is a model presenter. So this is the example for the collection presenter, and all it does is it's an enumerable, so I'm defining how to iterate over each one, and then this started to get a little challenging. So if you have a collection of active record models, if you really want to truly shield your view layer from your domain layer, from your models, your entities, whatever you want to call them, if you're looping over a collection, you need to instantiate the presenter for each one of those. So that's essentially what this is doing here, is grabbing the model and then creating the model presenter, which is, like I said, is the other type of presenter. So you got the collection presenter and the model presenter, and the collection presenter basically takes the collection of active record objects and creates a collection of model presenters from those active record objects. And so one thing I think too is a little, so here's the implementation of it over here. So it's just inheriting from collection presenter. I didn't find having to use like any actual methods on the collection presenters. Like this was pretty much the type of thing that I would have to do here and there. Like I want to filter the documents, like group the documents in the UI by custom and canned, or you could do like, you know, active and inactive. So that's really the only like behavior that I had to implement at the collection level. And then so here's finally the view, and so you can see and this is the index view. There's the presenter, and there's some like convenience methods that I created so that I could pass a block. Tried to avoid if statements in the view so that I could test the view logic a little easier without having to go from end to end as much. So that's what that does. It reaches into the policy and determines if the current user can do this thing and will display it or not. And then you're just pretty straightforward, just calling into this method here. And then because it's an enumerable, we can loop over and display each one. So then here's the update action. So just slightly different because now we're introducing a form object and a command and then a model presenter. Okay, so then here's an example of what the controller would look like. So obviously if we're updating, we actually have like a record to find, and then that's what we authorize instead of like in the index action where we just passed in a new. And then here's the presenter. So one thing I did notice, like this kind of felt a little awkward, and you can see there's some similarities between a presenter and a form. So I feel like a form essentially ends up being like a presenter, and it actually feels like almost like the form should be within the presenter. So in the view, you would call presenter.form, because I guess I was seeing a presenter as representing the whole page. So when you have a page that has a form, there's probably other elements on the page that you would be presenting, and the form is just one part of those elements. So I did feel like, looking back after I had started down this path, it seemed like, that could kind of be merged into, the form could be merged into the presenter, because it's essentially like a presenter. One thing that I wasn't crazy about, and this was because of how Rectify handles form objects, I didn't know any way around, like, basically they give you a from model, so you instantiate a form object from a model, but you can also do it from params, but you can't do both. And typically, most times, I want to instantiate all the attributes in the form from the model, but then I want to merge the params to overwrite whatever needs to be updated. So this was the best way that I could come up with doing that. And then here's the command. And this was another nice thing where you can like ls the directory of commands and see like, okay, this application does all these specific things, kind of gives you a good idea of, like what the system does. And you pass in the form and the active record object and the current account, or whatever. It's an arbitrary, whatever you need to handle updating a document. And then this is pretty straightforward. Just if it's successful, it's going to execute this block, and if it's not, it's going to do this. And these methods are just coming from something I defined on the application controller to like just generic error messages and success messages. And so here's an example of the form object. So this is pretty straightforward too. I think it's actually using Virtus, the Virtus gem, which gives you like attribute, like data, like coercion and validation, and but it looks like that gem, the maintainer of the gem, moved on to something different. So I think dry Ruby. I don't know if you are you familiar? I guess he found like, trying to deal with that sort of stuff in Ruby was difficult, so he went off and, after having learned whatever he learned from writing Virtus, he created a whole kind of like collection of different gems to handle like data coercion and validation and something else too. I can't quite remember. I think structs. So again, we need the policy, and I feel like this, like looking back, I'm not quite sure if I would probably experiment. If I had to work on another Rails app, I would probably experiment with the collection of dry Ruby gems that he created, because I started to run into weird things, like trying to do, in Rails we have like accepts nested attributes for, and that starts to get pretty hairy. And if you can nest forms, but then if you nest forms, you have to make sure you merge the errors. So I could see that kind of biting you down the road. I didn't run into anything else that was too horrible. And then here's the model presenter. So I already showed you the collection presenter, but it essentially inherits from the same base. And all it does is it just delegates to the underlying active record instance. So essentially a lot of what you're doing is just delegating to that, and then doing things like in the view, like moving if statements out into these types of methods where you're like yielding to a block, and that way you can test this, with a unit test instead of like a acceptance test or something. And that's it. Yeah, there's all just view specific logic. And then here's the command. So again, just where I'm using the rectify command, and then protecting myself, like hiding the implementation of that by using the Rails convention. And all you have to do, you can whatever you want to pass in initialize, and then when you call it, you can return like these values here. I found that was one thing that was nice, is if you open up a controller file and you look, you can see exactly the paths, the possible outcomes. It's a little easier to see like than conditionals or case statements or something. And I didn't really utilize like so rectify command uses something called whisper, which I guess gives like pub sub behavior. And I didn't really utilize this in any way, but I guess I could see like in your controllers if you wanted to do logging or notifications of some kind, you could subscribe to these events, and so you could keep that logic separate, which would be cool. But I didn't end up having to do that at all. And so just the last couple little things, just miscellaneous things from working on a project for 6 months. I ended up using Factories and Fixtures, and I kind of liked it. I know there's probably a lot of people that would disagree with using either or both. But Fixtures I found were nice for having a set, defined amount of data that you're familiar with, using real data that's named in a way that then you can have conversations about with people that you're working on the project with. And then another nice thing about using Fixtures in that way is, so your database state is you're running your tests based on a known state, a typical state that the application would probably be in at most times. And common scenarios, for example, a lot of the tests were making sure that a user from one account couldn't access the documents from another account as a common scenario to test. So having that already in place was nice. And then Factories, I would use the Factories just for on the fly kind of edge cases. So Fixtures kept it nice and fast. And then Factories gave me the flexibility to create any state that I needed that was kind of more edge case. Another nice thing about the Fixtures too was I could populate for development, a new developer that comes on the project. You can load all of Fixtures and immediately have test data for your development environment, so clicking through the UI.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
I was just thinking, you usually have seed files for something like that. But
Yeah.
You can use Fixtures too, I guess.
Well, so the seed, the seeds I used, that was slightly different. So I use seeds for production. So if I'm gonna set the app up on production, it's like a list of types or the admin user, that's needed just for production. I don't want the data from, I have two different kind of seeds that I need. I need a seed file for development that gives me all sorts of data that I can test with, and then I need a seed file for production, which gives me just the absolute minimum. That, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, because I remember I'm wait, am I supposed to use the I needed a way to separate them.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a way to.
Yeah. Well, to separate them, I ended up using. I used the Fixtures. Yeah.
I think it's a pretty smart idea if you work with other developers on the team, because that way they wouldn't get confused with production seed files and development seed files.
Yep.
Everybody knows when we're developing, we're using our Fixtures.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And it was nice to have you pull down the repo and because I created a rake task, you just and also too I could drop the database. I do repopulate, and it would drop everything and put me at a nice fresh state. Yeah, really quickly. So, and then one thing we tried, Josh and I paired for a little while, trying to really incorporate domain-driven design and keeping Rails grubby little fingers out of our out of our domain layer, and we had to forego everything he wrote because it took way too much time. So. I don't. I just Rails. I just feel it made me realize Rails is really great for prototyping, and if you really are building something that's going to be is going to be around long term, and you really want to have that clear separation of business logic and infrastructure, Rails is probably not, because you fight it and you lose out on a lot of conveniences, and then those conveniences kind of suck you back in because you're well, if I just do it this way or just inherit from this Rails class, then I have all this behavior available to me. The other thing that I kind of looking back, the folder structure is all based on infrastructure. So it's under the app folder, it's queries, commands, forms, mailers, so it's all infrastructure. It doesn't say anything about, which I think Uncle Bob talked about at one point. It doesn't have anything to do with the domain, if the business owner or the stakeholder looked at that. So I wasn't crazy about that, but it was just, it was still nice to see, to look in the app queries directory or the app commands directory and see, all of the behavior. One thing, this is kind of a little silly thing, but I created a Slack reminder to remind me to update the gem dependencies every week because I was working on the project for 6 months. So while I still had the ability before it went into production to keep everything like as cutting edge as possible.
Is it changing that often? You had to update every week?
Yeah, I did, yeah. Because it makes it easier because if there's any kind of breaking change, rather than waiting a really long time, it was like kind of like keeping your room clean. You know what I mean? Like if you just do 5 minutes every day.
To like hunt down to like which one of you broke.
Exactly. There was like there was like so few, that were, it was just like a handful. Yeah. So I like that. It worked out pretty well. There wasn't ever any big like blow up or anything like that. I just fixed maybe like 1 or 2 things here and there. I really followed like the refactor as you touch guideline, and that really worked out well. Yeah, it was. I tried to follow that pretty rigorously, and it felt good. Although I did notice that as I don't know if you guys experience this, but like as I go along in a project, as I start to understand more, I start building new functionality in like a slightly better way, and then some of the old stuff that I wrote, then it kind of becomes out of date, and then in my mind I'm like, but I found a better way to do it. Should I be consistent and stick with the old, like not as good way to maintain consistency, or just have them? So I don't know how to solve that problem, but it is something that I noticed that I wish I could do something, figure something out.
Experience and intuition.
Yeah.
Like, should I make the effort to do it at this point?
Yeah.
It's like when you make like a new a branch in GitHub to be like, this is like the point like plus next version, and then like you start like taking all that other code whenever you touch it, and like just start to be like, all right, slowly implement the new way.
Okay, that's a good idea. I like that, make that clear distinction. Yeah. It's a good idea. We used Amazon's key management service for our like sensitive environment values, which worked out pretty well. That was kind of cool. Josh actually built that part, so I'm not like super familiar with it, but it seemed pretty simple to get like up and running, and it was kind of nice. And we had like a little rake task, so you like add a new value to it and retrieve values from it, and all. It's all like nice and secure. And I already talked about the Rectus, the Virtus dry RB thing, so I'll thank y'all.